emergency for the first time in America.
This is Jim, and
Receiving this message. We are Ken Jennings and John Roderick. We speak to you from our present, which we can only assume is your distant past, the turbulent time that was the early 21st century.
Fearing the great cataclysm that will surely befall our civilization, we began this monumental reference of strange and obscure human knowledge. These recordings represent our attempt to compile and preserve wonders and esoterica that would otherwise be lost.
So whether you're listening from an advanced civilization or have just reinvented the technology to decrypt our transmissions, this is our legacy to you.
This is our time capsule. This is the Omnibus.
You have accessed entry 938.ES0914, certificate number 21776. Albert Pierrepoint.
Nice and clean. Second and third vertebrae. You see, we don't hurt him, Kirky. Instant. A professional job. Well done. She wouldn't have felt anything. All right, lower her down.
So we're here during Halloween week.
That's it.
Halloween week on Omnibus. I've already gone on record saying I don't support celebrating Halloween for an entire week.
And here it is, All Saints Day in our era, and you're still talking about Halloween.
Yeah, the problem is that Halloween falls on a Wednesday this year, and that's the most frustrating day for fun holidays. Right? You always want a fun holiday to fall on a Friday or a Saturday. Sunday is kind of a disappointment. Monday's pretty bad. But at least if Halloween's on Monday, you can have a Halloween party on Saturday night and feel like you're within spitting distance of it.
Yeah, I don't even know what best practice is. Is it better to have a Halloween party the previous weekend when Halloween's on a Wednesday?
Has to be. You can't have a Halloween party on November 4th.
But you can't move trick-or-treating. I had to take my kid trick-or-treating in the middle of the week.
Yep.
And she's going to have to go to school in the morning after staying up late.
Yep.
It's the worst.
Yep. And they're out there in the rain, surrounded by ghouls.
Filled with baby Ruths, nourished with nothing but baby Ruths and possibly the apples they bobbed for.
A
lot of that in my neighborhood.
It's one of the great things about bobbing for apples. You get to keep the apples.
The great thing about bobbing for apples is it doesn't actually exist, I think. I don't know. No one has bobbed for anything, much less an apple, in 50 or 60 years.
I am at a supreme disadvantage when it comes to bobbing for apples. Because I'm missing one of my front teeth. I'm missing one of my prime apple grabbing teeth.
I had a really bad underbite at one point. I couldn't bob for apples. That's the main reason I had jaw surgery.
You just pushed them around.
Just wanted to improve my apple bobbing abilities. Once a year, it was a terrible reminder of my handicap.
But Halloween, what are some of the stories that you think of that are associated with Halloween? Obviously, the headless horseman.
You're saying Halloween instead of Halloween.
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 Do you say Halloween? Do you really say Halloween?
Yeah. Halloween.
Halloween.
It's hollow to you? It's a hollow experience?
I don't know. Is this a regionalism? Are there some people in America that say Halloween?
I also pronounce the apostrophe. I say Halloween, like Hawaii.
Halloween.
Jack's O-lantern.
I also say Sasquatch instead of Sasquatch. I get a lot of flack.
I thought you said Sasquatch.
Sasquatch. Is the former mascot of the Seattle Sonics, wasn't it called Squatch or was it Squatch?
I never heard it said. I always assumed it was Squatch.
Yeah, I guess Squatch.
If I had been, I think I went to games. I think I would notice if I had heard somebody say Squatch because it would have bothered me.
It would be bothersome.
Don't squatch yourself. You're in public.
No, Sasquatch is what I always said. I don't know where I got it. People yell at me about it, but
the dictionary, by the way, is okay with Halloween or Halloween.
Oh,
it just puts the correct way first.
I feel like it's one of those things where people from Ohio say it one way and people from Indiana say it another way.
I think they say in the Nightmare Before Christmas, I think the song that says the word 1 million times says Halloween. So that means the coming generation, like Halloween, is going to die out now that Danny Elfman has made us all say Halloween.
I'm not so sure about that. I mean, I think futurelings are going to choose, like Are they an acolyte of Ken or are they an acolyte of John? If they're an acolyte of John, they will say Soviet until Soviet becomes like the accepted pronunciation.
You're going to have to choose. You can't kind of hedge and be like, Halloween, Soviet, Halloween. If you're lukewarm, the Lord will spew you forth from his mouth. You got to choose one or the other.
Halloween or Halloween? Well, the hero of today's episode, Albert Pierrepoint, also has a name that could be pronounced a lot of different ways. Albert Pierrepoint.
He is not French, however.
Well, it's a pretty Frenchy name.
It's very French, considering he's
Pierrepoint.
British born and bred. I'm not 100% sure Pierrepoint is right, although I know that's how you say Pierrepoint Street in Brooklyn.
I think Pierrepoint is as close as we're going to get for the purposes of this show, not being able to talk to Albert himself. But Albert had one of the jobs that we would associate with the dark holiday of Halloween. He was...
or holiday of Halloween.
Or holiday of Halloween. Billy Holiday. Halliday. Albert was an executioner.
A hangman.
And he was like, here, I'm going to give you this bell just so you can ding it for yourself.
Self-serve bell.
You're like, ha ha.
like a comedian who has his own like snare drum.
Yeah.
But
Get it. Albert was an executioner during a time when capital punishment was still widely practiced throughout Europe. We're now living in an era where capital punishment has been abolished in most of what we would describe as the Western world.
Only developing nations and the United States now have it. So
that's right.
Good job.
The United States, the last of the...
That's not quite true. I mean, China's killing more people today than Texas could in 100 years.
But most of that is just part of their manufacturing process.
Right. Those are all just children in factories. Now, there's plenty of executions as well, right?
For sure. I mean, capital punishment is still being debated in our contemporary time, whether or not it is a deterrent, whether or not it is a civil...
Just?
Right, just, or whether it's a component of civil society or a remnant of an earlier time. And feelings run high.
Our own home state, Washington State, in the last week or so, right? Has the Supreme Court abolished capital punishment?
Finally abolished it within Washington, although it is not abolished at the federal level. But there is
So there's still a way to get killed by the government in Washington. You just have to commit a federal crime.
There have been multiple hiatuses. Hiati.
It's pronounced Haiti.
Where capital punishment is not officially abolished, but it is...
You mean federally, like nationwide?
Well, nationwide and in different states, there will be a moratorium placed on capital punishment. There was a time when capital punishment was applied to crimes of all sorts, including treason and like sedition.
I feel like in the Bible, it's, if you wear two kinds of fibers in the same shirt.
Sure. If you go to church while you're menstruating.
Suffer a witch to live. There's so many ways to get executed in Leviticus.
Right.
Fewer in our era.
Thrown down a well. Now, in the current era, all the federal death sentences are for aggravated murder. And that tends to be, you don't get them for robbery or piracy that much anymore. Although maybe piracy... We don't see as many pirates here as we once did.
On Halloween you do, but
on Halloween you definitely do.
Those are just dressing up as Johnny Depp is not a capital crime. It's a fashion crime, but
and I sometimes dress as a love pirate, but that's not related to Halloween at all.
Tell me what a love pirate is.
Oh, for like a puffy shirt and an eye patch, but in the service of...
Are you stealing love?
I steal love from the rich and I give it to the poor.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah. See?
I don't know how that would actually work.
Well, you're not the intended victim or recipient of love piracy.
You're a heterosexual only love pirate?
Oh, not necessarily. I'm just saying you
don't love me enough either way.
are not involved. But Pierrepoint is a 20th century executioner. So not someone from the Spanish Inquisition or someone who worked during the French Revolution, but an Englishman.
And what are his dates?
He was born in the 20th century in 1905.
But he's killing people up until how late was the crown hanging murderers in the United Kingdom?
The UK passed what they called the Murder Act in 1965.
The Murder Act. in favor of murder. It made murder legally enforceable.
It was anti-state murder. In 1965, they didn't abolish it permanently. They put state executions on hold.
Oh, the Murder Act was not really about murderers. It was about not executing them.
No longer murdering murderers.
Gotcha.
But
so the name is kind of one of those where you can tell by the name what they're
the English do this all the time, right? They call things like, would you pass me the murder rope? And it's like, what is a murder rope? Oh, it's just what we call a dental floss. Like they have a very colorful way of using the English language, unlike us literalists here in America.
That does explain a lot about their dentistry. If they really did not know what floss was, that doesn't surprise me. I can't even do British teeth jokes.
No, that was good. That was funny. I'm in the habit now of sarcastic double bell ringing.
Give a man a bell and he will bell for a lifetime.
I have 2 bells now. But Pierrepoint came to his job, well, I guess you would say honestly. It was somewhat of a family business.
And this is a family business?
And this is true of a lot of executioners. It is a job that's handed down from father to son because there's a kind of tarnish on a man who takes this job upon himself.
It does make sense on a couple of levels. First of all, it's not likely to be a skill that you can be taught in any other way except knowing the person who's currently doing it.
Right.
And secondly, it's not something people would aspire to. Like, people don't sit around thinking, I'd like to be an executioner.
Well, funny you should mention it. People actually do. There are plenty of people in the historic record that we might think of now as having certain proclivities toward killing things.
These were serial killers channeling their...
Yeah, who figured out along the way that there was a state-sanctioned way they could exercise their feelings, I guess, their motivations. They could exorcise their demons by becoming trained murderers for the state. In fact,
How do we know? Like, did they later say, boy, I'm sure glad I didn't kill all those prostitutes because I got to work on death row instead?
Well, when this show is being recorded in 2018, the state executioner of the nation of Egypt is a man by the name of Hajj Abd al-Nabil, who recently gave an interview where he said, when I was a little boy, I loved killing cats and dogs. And what I would do is go out in the afternoon and catch animals and strangle them. And I was known in the neighborhood as the Little Satan.
Jeez.
I just love murdering things. And as I got older, I realized that this was a job and I was really good at it. So I went to the state and I said, I would like to be the executioner. And they put me in the executioner pipeline. And now I've never been happier. I just love killing people. I've killed like hundreds of Egyptians.
This is a novel argument for capital punishment, which is there's a certain number of people that are going to be killing a certain number of victims anyway.
Sure.
Why not funnel them into, killing actual criminals and doing the least harm?
Seems like a thing that you could have a kind of apprentice program where if you're really like people in your neighborhood could nominate you, like this kid's a sicko. Let's get him in the executioner game.
I'm just not convinced there's enough executions to actually do it for these guys.
Well, only because
there's no way this is a full-time job, right?
Only because we've limited it. We've limited capital punishment to aggravated murder. Like if we lowered the bar if we went back to Leviticus and said like, well, anytime you take the Lord's name in vain or spit on the street, that it could be a capital offense. Maybe.
And I don't expect you to be an expert on Sharia law, but in these Islamic countries, are there more executions because the bar is so much lower?
That's absolutely true. There's a lot more opportunity for the state executioner of Egypt to practice his trade because there are other crimes that receive the sentence of death.
It still can't be full-time.
Well,
I mean, I assume I could arrange with a little training, I could arrange the executions of like 5 or 6 people in a day.
This is typically true. And in the case of Albert Pierrepoint, his main job was as a grocer for much of his life. He delivered groceries and then carried out executions for the state when his services were needed.
It's kind of like you're a volunteer firefighter or something.
Right. And in the case of executions, they were paid piecemeal. You got paid by the execution.
By the victim.
So you weren't on any kind of state pension. You didn't receive benefits. You just did this contract work, but you had to be on the list. You had to be authorized as a head executioner. And Albert,
that almost makes it more awkward that someone's going to give you a check or an envelope at the end of as soon as the guy stops kicking, you're going to have to go by a counter and be like, here you go. Here's your 350 quid or whatever.
Oh, wow. They would love it if it was that much. It was about 150 pounds.
Really?
It was a situation where you would be paid some upfront and then paid later, not after the person was killed, but after it was determined that the execution had been pulled off with decorum, successfully done. Because part of the job of
there's a trial, a series of judges, a panel of judges, and they lift up signs 9.5, 9.0.
It is a hazard of the occupation that it's surprisingly easy to botch an execution. And throughout history, good executioners are the ones who achieve a clean, painless, efficient death of the sentence.
For most of history, was it an axeman? Is that who it was for centuries in most of the world?
Well,
guy with an axe and a stump?
There have been a lot of different evolutions in an attempt to find the most merciful way to kill. Now, I'm not talking about the executioners of the Middle Ages or no one expects the Spanish Inquisition, but they did expect during the Spanish Inquisition that you would be tortured to death. And
right.
Executions
they weren't known for trying to find the most merciful way.
Although mercy was a component of the overall sort of arc of an execution. Like, one of the common ways of executing people then was to break them on the wheel, which is kind of a misnomer, because what they did was tie them to a board and then drop a wagon wheel on them repeatedly.
I thought they were on the rim of some kind of a giant torture wheel.
So the way it worked was they would use this wheel, this heavy wooden wheel ringed in iron. They would tie you to a board with little blocks sort of supporting your joints, various parts of your body, and then they would drop the wheel on you from a height to break your bones repeatedly.
To make sure all the weight goes onto the knee or whatever.
So they would break your shin, and then they would move it up and break your thigh, and then they would break your arms both on either side of your elbow joint, and they would break you multiple times and break your spine, and then you're still alive, and then they would tie you to the wheel where they would thread you through the spokes with all of the new joints created by
because you're much more flexible now.
That's right, all your broken bones. And then they would leave you to die on the wheel.
So which part of that is merciful?
None of it, but the executioner was, at every stage of the way, there was an opportunity to deliver a killing blow.
If the victim would confess
or
accept Jesus.
If there was some sense that there was something in the nature of their crime that, although they were condemned to being broken on the wheel, they also didn't deserve to suffer that much. I mean, you're going to be broken by the wheel one way or another, but they would kill you first and then break you.
So the decree might say, with some discretion left to the executioner as to at what point he actually kills the victim.
Right. Or some magistrate would give him the sign from across the room, you can let's put an end to this guy.
Oh, so it is somebody else making the call.
Depends.
You don't have to be judge, jury, and executioner.
Depends on how much authority the executioner has in that moment. Mm-hmm. But that was the great thing about the guillotine, the invention of the guillotine. It was an instance where technology had created an infallible
It's
machine.
Binary. It's 0 or 1.
Right.
Either the blade is suspended or it's not.
Although there are plenty of examples where the guillotine failed in one way or another and didn't make a clean cut.
I think there might also be some evidence that, the guillotine may not be the most merciful way of killing because it is too sudden, that consciousness can continue in a severed head for a matter of seconds, in which case the victim is actually aware of having died in a horrifying way, which is presumably not what you want.
I mean, all they're really aware of is that now they're inside of a basket.
And you think that might be nice?
I mean, it's for a couple of seconds. I mean, who knows?
Here are the only other times I can think of it being inside a basket. If you're in a hot air balloon.
Right.
And that's very nice.
If you're a kitten.
If you're a picnic.
Right. If you're a bear inside of a picnic basket.
All the other ways of being in a basket are kind of nice. So you're right. Maybe it's a nice way to go out.
Yeah, you're like, finally, I'm at rest in a basket.
This whole time I have not been in a basket. And now I am.
As the 20th century progressed, or in the 19th and 20th century, styles of execution really took on a regional quality.
France was still guillotining people into the 1970s, right?
And it was. And in Germany, that was also the state method of execution.
Germany was beheading people.
Whereas in England, it was strictly hanging. And in the United States, we pioneered death by electrocution because that was a very American way of, like, here's some technology that we can really apply to this. And it was thought of as humane because the electricity would shock you and make you unconscious.
Although, it's not clear to me. It's not intuitive that some new violent, scary technology will obviously be the most humane way to kill someone.
No. The New York State executioner, like the big executioner in New York, was a man named Robert Elliott. And the job description was not executioner. It was New York State electrician. That was the name of his job.
Was he also in charge of the fuse box?
He had an electrical contracting business because, as you've already kind of laid out, right? Being an executioner is not a full-time job. So everybody had like a side gig. And Robert Elliott he was doing, I guess, like putting new chandeliers in people's houses and wiring up the light out in the pig pen outside.
And the story in the United States is true, right? About Thomas Edison
electrocuting an elephant in order to prove that alternating current was
bad. And just the fact that, so Westinghouse's competing standard, alternating current, was what was being used for these early executions. Edison just jumped on that to be like, see how bad AC is? Like, right. We're actually killing people with it.
Elephant killers.
And convicts.
And people. Elliot had he had it all figured out. He would shock people with 200 volts and then he would back it off. Or he'd shock them with 2,000 volts and then back it off to 500 and let them just cook for a while.
He's like the artisanal executioner in The Princess Bride.
Yeah, right.
Like he's like one of these barbecue dads with a theory.
Yeah, and then he would zip it back up to 2,000 again.
And what's the theory here? That this is the most
humane, the first shock knocks them unconscious, but then you have to cook their insides for a while, and then you shock them again to stop their heart, and then cook them a little bit more, and then shock them one last time for a good measure.
I feel like if you give a man a dial, he will want to twiddle with it. I'm not a recording artist, but when I see people in a recording studio, it always seems like they just like the fun of twiddling with their dials, right?
When we
they feel like they're at mission control.
When we were in the studio a lot, it was a known quantity that there would be some parts of the board that the engineer knew didn't work, were broken, like certain buttons and certain faders that did nothing. That when people from the record label would come in, or band members that felt like they needed to be more involved in it than everybody else agreed they did, you would station them over at that session and say like, oh, okay, do you want more guitar? Like, here's your fader, here are your knobs, you can pan it like this. And you see it all the time. People like, they're really in the mix and they're moving this thing around and they can't hear. Nothing's happening. You'd give those controls to your A&R guy and say like, yeah, turn up the bass, bro.
I can just imagine this guy working his like electric chair dial though, like as if he's hearing inner voices like an artist.
He was an example of Robert Elliott was an example of an executioner that, and this is a common trait among most executioners. They feel like it is a job. They're performing on behalf of the state, and they don't have an emotional investment in murdering people or in the death penalty either way. I mean, they're not like our friend Al-Nabil who comes straight out and says, I'm really into this.
Well, it's hard to say whether that's just some different stigma in our culture where, are there people in our culture as well who would say that as well if they knew they weren't going to get hounded for it?
It's a good question. And there is a real premium in England and Germany and in the United States on the idea that the executioner is dignified and executions themselves are colorless and dignified. We don't want a big scene. We typically don't like people shouting from the gallows.
In movies in the American frontier and in maybe 18th and 19th century Europe, it is a spectacle, right? Like it's something to do. Soccer having not yet been invented yet.
Right, on behalf of the crowd, but it's still formalized. I mean, if you just want to kill somebody, you can just go strangle them on the ground or stick them with a knife. But to tie their hands behind their back and walk them up a scaffold and drop them through a trapdoor it's ceremonial. It's ceremonial, and so there is a formality to it. In fact, in Germany, all the way through World War II, the state executioner insisted on, his name was Johann Reichert, he insisted on wearing a top hat and tails, the traditional uniform of the German executioner, for all of his many executions, which numbered into the thousands. He was an executioner that started during the Weimar Republic and then became the state executioner of Nazi Germany. Executed thousands of people, always wearing his top hat. And then after the war, in the immediate aftermath of the war, he was captured by the Americans, and they needed somebody to start executing Nazis. And so they said, keep up the good work, and put him to work for a whole nother year. So
that's a really interesting case because the Allies are trying and sentencing people who killed on the orders of their superiors, right? And the Reich's official hangman is maybe not so different. Like he's also an arm of the state. Hey, he can say the same thing. Hey, I just killed the people they told me to, which is what every commandant and guard at Bergen-Belsen can say.
And maybe dark humor, but after he spent a year executing that first wave of people after the war who,
like who went first, the higher ups?
No, because the Nuremberg trials weren't for another couple of years where not a couple of years, but there was a sense that we needed to try the higher ups of Nazi Germany very formally and publicly. Mm-hmm. But there were a lot of people that needed to be dealt with in the immediate aftermath. And they tended to be like the commandant of Belsen. Actually, the commandant of Belsen was executed by Pierrepoint, who went over several times after the war to perform executions on behalf of the English government. Oh. But Reichert decided in 1946 that he was concerned that he was executing what he described as innocent men. And so
he only became concerned about this once it was Nazis and not their victims.
Yeah, once it was the Nazis, and so he retired, and then eventually was arrested, and he was not himself sentenced to death. He was just charged with.
But he was charged with war crimes for having been an executioner.
Charged with war crimes, but on a smaller scale. He was given 2 years of probation or something.
He had to pick up litter at the side of the Autobahn.
Right, he had to plant flowers in graveyards. Pierrepoint would have been the obvious choice to be the executioner of Nuremberg.
Well, yeah, he must have. I mean, if His Majesty's government is going to send someone over, he must have been the guy, right? Was he a prestigious executioner?
He was. He was considered sort of the most professional, the preeminent executioner of his day.
One thing I was thinking is it can't matter that much to the victim. You know? Like the victim doesn't care if Johann has a top hat or not. I mean, I'm sure he or she would appreciate a certain courtesy and certainly the skill that leads to the most painless death possible. But the whole idea that there should be a ceremony is really for the institution itself, right? It's the less it looks like a lynch mob, the less it looks like the illegal kind of murder, the more legitimacy there is to the enterprise.
Right, but from the victim standpoint, I think you really do hope you get a very professional executioner.
Are you talking about the actual mechanics of the knot and so forth?
Yes, because the opportunity for botched execution is surprisingly high. Now, the English preferred to hang people, and they developed what they called the long drop style of hanging. which was to drop the person at least 10 feet when they hit the end of the rope, it truly snapped their neck in what's called the executioner's break. And it's a kind of injury, a neck injury that you can get snowboarding too. But it's a specific kind of break that kills you instantly.
It's a common misconception that hanging is supposed to kill by strangulation, right? It is not supposed to.
It is not. You do not want to strangulate. You want to die of a broken neck. And yet a lot of countries that practiced execution by hanging did short drop.
Because snowboarding hadn't been invented.
Snowboarding hadn't been invented, and short drops seemed more, it seemed cheaper because
less rope.
Yeah, that's right. It's a lot shorter.
You don't have to worry about all that headspace.
Well, and you didn't need those tall ceilinged execution rooms. You could do it almost anywhere.
Shorter gallows.
But Pierrepoint was actually consulted by a lot of countries, including Austria, and he had a whole system. He would do practice drops with big bags of sand.
Oh, the same weight as the prisoner.
The same weight as the prisoner.
It's like Indiana Jones switching the...
Right. And he would leave the bag of sand tied to the rope overnight to stretch the rope so there wouldn't be...
Right. The rope's got to be pre-stretched,
right,
or otherwise you're going to get a bungee effect that might result in less force on the knot.
Right. So he had dimensions for the gallows and how big the trap door should be. Like, he had professionalized executions.
It is artisanal. Like, he's tailoring it to the victim based on their build and weight.
He would actually go and check out the condemned prisoner to see if their shoulders were broader or if he needed a little bit of, extra English on the knot.
He's not creepy, I bet. I bet it would be, and maybe it's just because I know he's British. But like, if I'm imagining some Old West hangman or mortician, I'm imagining some awful guy whose fingernails are too long, some kid catcher type. And I'm assuming that Pierrepoint is all business. He's from a nation of shopkeepers.
As time went on, he decided he wanted to leave the grocery business and open a pub. He felt like having a pub was an opportunity for him to be his own boss. And so he did open a pub. The pub was called Help the Poor Struggler. I mean, the English, they name their houses and they name their pubs strangely.
I mean, I love the names of English pubs, but Help the Poor Struggler is a complete sentence.
Yeah, Help the Poor Struggler was the name of his pub.
There's rarely a verb, is what I'm saying.
in the pub?
In the name of the pub. It's usually, the Crown. It's not Wear the Crown.
Robert the Bruce died on the cross. So
at the same time he's pouring ales for people, he's still occasionally getting called up to execute criminals.
Not occasionally. He's the chief executioner of the United Kingdom during this period, but also the pub man, and would sit and pour beers and sing songs.
Oh, that's part of the appeal of the pub. He's like the early, the boxer who has a steakhouse or whatever.
Right. But famously, he was called to execute one of his favorite customers.
No.
A man by the name of James Corbett, who was such a regular at the bar that Pierrepoint called him Tish, and James Corbett called Pierrepoint Tosh. They had nicknames for each other, Tish and Tosh. And they would sit at the bar and sing in harmony with one another. And then James Corbett killed his mistress in a fit of anger.
After having too much to drink at
the bar.
The Help the Poor Struggler.
And then ended up going to the gallows, and Pierrepoint was his executioner and came into his cell and greeted him, hello, Tish.
Do you think that would be a comfort for the condemned to know the guy? According
to Pierrepoint, it calmed him, and the fact that they had, Pierrepoint said he kept it light. He kept it professional. But like, if he faltered at the step, he said, come on, Tish, old man, or whatever, and like walked him up, and it all went off without a hitch. But Pierrepoint, he used that as an example later on in life as he reevaluated his career and decided that he was anti-capital punishment. He said, if it were truly a deterrent to murder, this man of all men who knew I was a hangman and was his friend, it would have deterred him maybe more than anyone else. I mean, to drink with me night after night, the hangman. And he said, if this guy would go ahead and kill his wife anyway, or kill his mistress anyway, it's not like it's going to deter someone out in the streets.
I think there have been many, many attempts to show that capital punishment does deter future crime in some way, and they've all come up short, whether you know the executioner or not. But it seems like that must have been hard on Pierrepoint, even if it's a blessing to his friend to have a friendly face at the gallows.
Well, Pierrepoint always claimed that he had a detached and professional relationship to execution because he was just doing his job.
He's got to tell his story in a way that makes sense to him, though.
But
you know?
he also would slip into kind of a strange way of talking about it, where he considered his job to have a sacred quality, and that every execution he tried to make as perfect as possible because of there was a spiritual element, that he was a conductor of the condemned out of this world. And there were a lot of critics at the time that were suspicious of the way he talked.
That makes me a little skeptical.
He would say things like, I had to execute James Corbett, or I had to execute. He famously executed Lord Haw Haw after the war, the propaganda guy? The great propaganda.
Oh, that should be an entry in the omnibus, Lord Haw Haw.
Lord Haw Haw was the treasonous sort of Tokyo Rose of the Eastern War.
Fascist Britain.
He executed Lord Haw Haw, but he always described it as a duty that he had to undertake. And there were contemporary critics who said, you don't have to execute anyone. You could just own your bar. And
most pub owners execute 0 Nazis.
So it does suggest that maybe Pierrepoint was...
well, it just means that it does something to you to kill 400 people on the job and have to explain that to yourself in a way that does not damn you, right?
Right.
In a way that makes it seem laudable in a way. I mean, I don't think it's weird that he claims to be anti-capital punishment even while he's doing it. I mean, he's a government employee. I'm sure the government is full of people who are carrying out policies they disagree with. I'm sure
That's
the military is as well.
If it's lawful, then...
Sure. We've talked about, for example, the, a military officer who has to be the one to turn the key and launch the missiles, for example, and how they all say, of course I would do it. Like the system only works if it doesn't matter what I think.
Right.
And of course, that system might be, in the larger sense, just as morally bankrupt as the state killing a murderer. I'm not saying it's not.
But the whole idea of law and order is that, like, our police officers are intentionally not charged with the responsibility of judging the crime. They are instruments. They're meant to be instruments of the state law, and they're there to enforce it without prejudice. Now, you can't have police robots, or not yet. I'm sure
we're speaking to people who have interacted with RoboCop today.
Yeah, futurelings are shaking their heads ruefully from inside their cells where all future inhabitants live, guarded by RoboCops. But now, one of the big problems of policing is how much authority to give individual police to make decisions on the fly. And even we've just come through a period where the state tried to limit the authority that judges had by setting mandatory sentencing limits and so forth to take away the independence of judges and systematize sentencing.
And all it takes is reading one story about a wacko judge making somebody do something humiliating for a minor offense, or one bad cop who is demonstrably prejudiced in how he carried out his duty or whatever. And you're like, yeah, I want those laws.
Well, and a lot of those laws actually came in the other direction to tighten up judges that were too lenient on prisoners, that judges where they were taking into consideration that the offender came from a broken home. And so
the idea is the state needs to be more dispassionate.
That's right.
Think less about the actual individual situation.
So both sides of the political coin are trying to take the human element out of law enforcement because of what they perceive to be the risk of too much chaos. Although I think studies show the more human element there is in terms of training people well to make judgment calls on the spot that do take into account the situation, that aren't just going, quote unquote, by the book. That's actually where you get community policing and effective jurisprudence.
And on a larger scale, it keeps you from building an apparatus where, the decision makers can be too insulated from the effects. When you get drones just bombing weddings,
Right.
and everybody can shrug because nobody knows anybody who dropped the bomb,
Or you get into situations where the law then becomes completely political, and all of a sudden you have police who are receiving very different instructions depending on who's in office.
Sure.
Which is a really bad way to go about policing. But in the case of being an executioner, I don't think you want a lot of discretion on the part of the person performing the job. You kind of want them, if killing people is lawful, then you want it at least to be done efficiently and mercifully.
Right. I have no problem with that guy being a cog. I mean, even if he writes a memoir, I feel like, what does this guy have to say? Like, his opinions about capital punishment are irrelevant to what he did.
Right.
I don't think there's even any element, like, I'm not overly troubled with concerns of, the ethics of what he did. I wouldn't do it though. Like, I think I would have a visceral problem with it.
I mean, there's a curious case, and it's not extremely well documented, but well enough documented that it's reported that in the 18th century in Ireland, there was a woman who mistakenly murdered her own son because her son had gone to America to make his fortune, and he'd sent her money over the years to support her. But he returned to Ireland bearded and somewhat in disguise, and came to his mother's house and said, will you take me in as a lodger for tonight because there's no room in the inn? And she did, and saw that he was rich, and murdered him in the night for his bag of gold. And then in the morning, searching through his pockets, discovered from his letters and other things on his possession that it was actually her son who had come back to surprise her.
This is too good to be true. This is a de Maupassant short story.
Yeah, it's pretty nice. And then she was sentenced to hang. And on the day of her execution, along with 25 other prisoners, the executioner took ill. And the sheriff was faced with an angry mob who had come to watch the week's execution. And as he sort of cast about for a solution, this woman, who is known as Lady Betty, raised her hand and said, "If you will not kill me today, I will perform the role of executioner."
Whoa.
And everybody said, well, the sheriff was like, okay. And I'm sure that the other 25 prisoners were like, whoa, wait a minute. I didn't know that was an option. Like, I'll be the executioner. But it was too late. Lady Betty had gotten ahead of them. And she performed the executions with cold efficiency and was returned to her cell, having been spared for the day after killing these 25 prisoners. And the following week, the executioner died of his illness. And the sheriff said, Betty, if I commute your sentence to life in prison, will you continue to work as the executioner? And she happily agreed and continued to live in the prison and perform the job of executioner free of charge.
Did she live as a prisoner?
Lived as a prisoner, partly because she was so hated in the community that it wasn't safe for her to live outside. And she continued from 1780 until 1802 to work as the executioner for Northern Ireland, and then retired and lived within the prison walls. She had a little garden that she tended and happily lived in prison until her death.
The stigma against executioners is such that in a lot of modern methods, it's set up so that nobody actually knows who did it, right? A firing squad will have multiple rifles.
Right.
A not a gas chamber, but a lethal injection machine will have 3 people pressing a button and only one of them is hooked up or something. Isn't that right? I think they do have mechanisms like this.
Yeah, and there were that was always an element of it in the distant past, that the executioner would wear a hood.
Oh, right.
And that was, I think, the hood was to protect the executioner from, because it was such an untouchable job where your neighbors, you weren't invited to all the nice clubs, right? If you were the town executioner.
Just take off the hood.
But I think the innovation of the firing squad in a military context was that you didn't want to charge any one soldier with killing his compatriot.
His fellow soldier.
And out in the field, you wouldn't necessarily have an executioner along with you. A lot of those firing squads were ad hoc. And that's true now of if you have 3 people all pushing the button at the same time, it's to distribute that responsibility enough that it gives you as a participant at least plausible deniability to yourself as you lay in bed. It wasn't me. It wasn't my bullet. I aimed over the guy's head, or the button I pushed was surely the one that was disconnected.
There was a U.S. politician who ran for president, and when it came out that he had actually done executions in the past, his opponents used this kind of executioner stigma. They called him the Buffalo Hangman because he'd been the sheriff in Buffalo, New York, and he'd done 2 executions. And actually, very badly. One of his knots was so bad that when the sheriff pulled the lever, he just kicked for 23 minutes.
Ugh.
Whereas I read that Pierrepoint had a record of 7.5 seconds at one point, which is very good. But the Buffalo Hangman, despite the public's distaste for an executioner, actually won the presidency twice. Grover Cleveland was a former sheriff and 2-time executioner.
Is that right? Is that why they called Grover Cleveland the Buffalo Hangman?
You thought it was his country music career.
And I did.
No, he had 2 non-consecutive. He hanged someone on 2 non-consecutive occasions.
Wow. I mean, Buffalo Hangman would be actually a great country western album.
I kind of want it to be like my World Series of Poker name or my pool hall name or something.
Buffalo Hangman.
Look out, it's the Buffalo
Ken
Hangman.
Buffalo Hangman Jennings. The most famous / infamous American hangman of the 20th century was a man named John Clarence Woods. And during the Nuremberg trials, which were sort of the last big international trial of, and in a way, the invention of the idea of a war criminal, it was on the international stage, and there was a lot of pressure to accomplish this trial of these men of crimes against humanity and dispatch them in a way that was efficient and made the case that there was a new sort of global order of justice.
But again, I want to say that that's a little weird. Like, hey, we're killing Nazis in an efficient and antiseptic way. Like, so it's, the Nazis were also famous for their efficient killing machines, like I'm a little skeeved out by the idea that we can make death so antiseptic that everyone just kind of nods and smiles.
It is skeevy and it is paradoxical.
Right.
And that, I think now when you go to The Hague and there are war crimes tribunals, the death sentence is off the table.
Yeah, I think so too.
But at the time there was still a feeling like, what happens to Hermann Goering? What do you do? Do you really just put him in a cell and give him 3 squares a day? Like, there needed to be some kind of ultimate justice. Albert Pierrepoint was the obvious man to be chosen as the executioner. And
he's got experience, he's got skill.
And during World War II, from England, he handled all the executions for the Allies.
You mean he'd fly over? Or you mean in England? When they had...
If there were traitors, if there were U.S. service people who were convicted of crimes, Pierrepoint would do the job. But when it came to Nuremberg, for whatever reason, the executioner was chosen from the ranks of the United States Army, and the job went to this man, John Clarence Woods, a master sergeant, who had been in the Navy back in the 1920s and went AWOL and was convicted of and court-martialed and diagnosed with like psychopathy, something called psychopathic inferiority, but without active psychosis. And he was discharged from the Navy. But then 12 years later, after working in a feed store, basically, he re-enlisted in the Army during the
Second War.
And was a sort of not very successful soldier, not regarded as very intelligent, and found himself thrust into this role.
Why would you, of all the guys, is this like when a radio station has a contest and then suddenly some old lady is hosting Saturday Night Live? Or like, why this guy?
Well, because they were looking for a hangman and looking for volunteers, and Woods claimed that he had experience as a hangman. He said that he'd acted as an assistant hangman in Texas and in Oklahoma, and the Army didn't really verify his claims, didn't make any attempt to check it out.
It's starting to seem like our Egyptian guy who just wants to hang stuff.
He had no, like, looking back now, we realize he had no experience. He was a buck private at the time, but he was immediately promoted to master sergeant and became the official U.S. executioner of soldiers convicted of crimes in the final days of the war, and then showed up at Nuremberg.
On the strength of that, got the Nuremberg gig.
Now, during the war, he was accused of bungling multiple hangings of U.S. servicemen. But somehow, again, that didn't impede his career advancement. And with Albert Pierrepoint waiting in the wings with his like time-tested long drop hanging technology and his stretched out ropes and his bags of sand,
Master hangman.
the job instead went to Master Sergeant Woods, who, by all accounts, bungled almost every single one of the Nuremberg hangings.
Wow.
Leaving the Nazis dangling on the end of the rope, choking to death, twisting in the wind.
Is there any thought that somebody high up wanted this? Like, let's get this guy. He'll probably make them suffer.
This is often true of accusations of hangmen throughout the ages where they were accused of being bunglers. There are plenty of examples of executioners back in the day when it was an axe, really, that was the main instrument.
And they didn't get all the way through.
They didn't get all the way through, or they
needed a few.
The first blow landed on their shoulder or whatever. That rather than, that half the people were like, he's a bungler, he's an oaf. The other half were like, this was intentional. He was meant to do a bad job, to add that extra spin to make that execution go off badly.
To make this unpopular figure suffer the more.
So those high-ranking Nazis, a lot of them, they died at the end of John Woods's rope and did so painfully and died of strangulation rather than of the hangman's break. And then Sergeant Woods, maybe in the final irony, he denied that he ever bungled an execution. He said he did a great job and everybody...
I'm really good, says guy who is not really good.
That's right. He said that all the GIs that helped him did a real swell job. The way I look at this hanging job, somebody has to do it. I got into it by accident years ago in the States, just like putting the shine on it. He seems like he enjoyed his work. But Woods met his end still in the Army, electrocuted by accident while trying to repair a lighting set.
Not while trying to put somebody in the chair.
No, after Nuremberg, he did not continue as the Army's executioner. They just put him back into the ranks, and he was out fussing with some light bulbs and
some angry Nazi ghost stuck his finger in the socket
with rope burns all around. Came along and just sort of put one leg of the ladder in a bucket of water. And
What happened to Pierrepoint?
Pierrepoint lived to a ripe old age. He lived until 1992. He was born in 1905.
So he outlived his own profession in the UK by decades.
By decades, right. He, after the fact, wrote an autobiography and for a time was very vocally against the death penalty.
Which is a coup for the movement, right? Like
Right.
if, I think in the US it happened with the plaintiff in Roe versus Wade, later became super pro-life, and that was a big deal.
Yeah.
He's showing up on Donahue all the time.
Everybody's looking for...
Or when the guy that said, "Can you hear me now?" I switched to Sprint.
oh, that was a big one.
That's huge.
Right.
That changed my mind.
Sure, you're looking for some kind of neat closure, and Pierrepoint's contention that the death penalty never deterred anyone, and also that it was not effective as even a crime suppressant, was fairly widely reported in its time. But then as he got older, maybe unsurprisingly, he revisited his attitudes and said, well, I said it didn't work as a deterrent back in a time when there just wasn't that much crime. But now here in the late 80s in Britain.
Oh, he turned into one of these old guys grousing about street crime and probably saying racial slurs.
Sure, these thugs who are out with their hippity hop and spray painting on the walls. And so he sort of took back a little bit of his opposition to the death penalty and felt like maybe there are some crimes that deserve the ultimate punishment.
As long as he didn't put on a hangman's hood and become some neighborhood vigilante and start doing away with vandals and muggers.
No, he didn't. But our friend Al-Nabil in Egypt has gone on record saying even when he retires, if they ever need him to come back and do some executioning, they have his number. All they have to do is call.
Well, you know what they say, retirement kills. You gotta keep your hand in something. And that concludes Albert Pierrepoint. Entry 938.ES0914, certificate number 21776, in the omnibus. Speaking of fatal things and fatal mistakes, we hope that social media does not exist in your time.
I'll say, the ultimate killer.
Right. Killer of time, killer of your any feeling of goodwill you might have towards your fellow men and women.
The silent spring.
But if in our day, we were devoted to the principles of the omnibus and diffusing them far and wide, propounding them. Is that right?
We propound them.
Do we propound and diffuse?
I wouldn't say diffuse, but disseminate.
Disseminate. That's what we do.
Yeah.
We cast our seed.
Yes.
Far and wide.
In different ways, we do.
As evidence of that, you could find us at Omnibus Project on just about every social media platform, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. John is at John Roderick on Instagram and
Roderick,
Twitter.
At John Roderick.
That can't be right. I'm pretty sure. Let me look. I'm pretty sure it's Roderick.
Roderick.
Roderick. Don't forget the E. And I was at Ken Jennings. Don't forget that second N on Twitter. You could email us at omnibusproject@howstuffworks with urgent digital communications. You could also send us tangible objects if you wanted to.
Please do.
We're really, really into that.
No candied apples, nothing with razor blades or poison in it.
You know, that's all fake. Not a single case of poison candy. We were all scared for nothing. But
I think we've covered that on the omnibus.
Maybe we have.
A little bit.
It sounds like I'm encouraging people to be the pioneer, the first one to send poison candy to us, and I really don't think you should do that.
Don't do it. Don't do it. Ken and I have debated whether or not we would eat foodstuffs sent to us in the mail by strangers, and we've decided that we won't.
We're 0 for 1. We did not chew on the smoked roots or whatever.
So don't waste your time.
But what if it was like a candy bar you like? What if it was on Halloween? What if a whatchamacallit shows up? Or an Almond Joy?
You remember what they said? That they would stick hypodermic needles through the wrappers into those candy bars and put poison in them when you couldn't see.
I'm going to look for a syringe hole. I'm going to spend all of 20 seconds looking for a syringe hole. And if it's not like something gross like a Three Musketeers...
Three Musketeers aren't gross. Three Musketeers are totally good. What's gross is an Almond Joy.
Almond Joy is coconut, an actual food. Three Musketeers is nougat, which I think is, comes from meteorites or something.
Nougat is one of the great foods. Coconut is not a food. Coconut is a gourd. Coconut is a weapon.
I am almost certain coconut is not a gourd, but also I'm not going to look it up.
Coconut is something that you milk. You take the milk out and you make like sweet tea, but you don't have to eat the fingernail clippings that are inside of it.
Oh, to you, that's like leftover.
No,
it's like the dregs.
Name one good thing made of coconut meat.
I don't like that you're calling it coconut meat.
That's what they call it, meat.
Nut meats.
Nut meat.
I enjoy nut meats on the holidays. What was I even going to say? Oh, the address. Yeah. Address, yeah. So send stuff. John will not eat it. I will, even if it's got coconut in it. P.O. Box 55744, Shoreline, Washington, 98155. Also, feel free to congregate with your fellow futurelings on Facebook on the Futurelings fan page.
Listeners, from our vantage point in your distant past, where we still say the word Facebook out loud.
You think it's a profanity or it's like the F word in the future?
Something, I'm sure. We have no idea how long our civilization or Facebook survived. I think our civilization will outlast Facebook. In fact, I was thinking the other day, people used to congregate, like fans of my band would congregate on the message board of my band's website, thelongwinters.com. I don't even know if that message board is still there, but it was a fun time, kind of like what happens at the Omnibus Futurelings Facebook page.
It does feel like a 90s internet phenomenon. People have found a fun message board.
Yeah, it's a fun message board. Now, the reason that it's successful is that people apparently are already on Facebook, so it's easy for them. They don't have to navigate to a separate place. But how hard would it be for us to take our Futurelings community and decamp it from Facebook and put it somewhere where people would want to visit it and enjoy it? To those of you in the future who are rolling right now in your cloud-based homes, your cloud-based, I guess, sky cabins.
Yeah, they live in sky cabins.
I think that you know already the answer. You know that people who love Omnibus find another place, another venue where they can live and laugh and love.
It's like whack-a-mole. You can't keep love for the Omnibus Project down.
Right. We don't know, though. We cannot look into the future ourselves. We can only speculate. We hope and pray that this particular catastrophe for Facebook does come soon. And if it does come soon, this recording, like all our recordings, will be partially responsible for the death of Facebook. It will be another reason we are lauded as heroes to the future. If Providence allows, we hope to be back with you very soon, next week, in November 2018, for another entry in the Omnibus.